Welcome back to the Sotri Time on History Sparks. I am Sarah, and today I want to tell you the whole story.
Not just the famous part, not just the ringing and the founding fathers and the 4th of July postcard version. The whole story, from the very beginning to the moment it stopped ringing forever, because the full story of this bell is one of the most surprising, moving, and deeply human stories in all of American history. And today, July 8th, Liberty Bell Day, is exactly the right day to tell it. Let's start at the very beginning. The year is 1751. The Pennsylvania Provincial Assembly, the colonial legislature of Pennsylvania, decides they need a new bell for the tower of their state house in Philadelphia. To call people to meetings, to announce important news, to mark the hours, the way a church bell does, or a school bell, or a town clock. They order it from the Whitechapel Bell Foundry in London, one of the most respected bell makers in the world, and they give the foundry one specific instruction about what to put on it. The words come from the Bible, from the book of Leviticus, chapter 25, verse 10. Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. Penn had been ahead of his time in ways that still astonish historians. The verse felt fitting. 50 years of charter, proclaim liberty, hallow the 50th year. They just chose a Bible verse. And everything else followed from that choice. The bell arrives in Philadelphia on September 1st, 1752. It is enormous, over 2,000 pounds of bronze, more than 5 feet tall. Workers haul it off the ship and prepare to hang it in the steeple of the Pennsylvania State House. But first, they ring it to test the sound. And on the very first stroke of the clapper, it cracks. The assembly is mortified. They want to ship it straight back to London. They hand it to 2 local Philadelphia craftsmen named John Pass and John Stowe. Pass and Stowe melt the whole thing down. They add copper to make the metal less brittle and a touch of silver to sweeten the tone. They recast it from scratch. They are so proud of their work that they add their own names to the inscription. Pass and Stowe, Philad 1753, which you can still read on the bell today. They hang the new bell in the steeple in the spring of 1753, and people ring it, and the sound is terrible. Eyewitnesses describe it as sounding like 2 coal shuttles being banged together. The assembly is horrified all over again. They write back to Whitechapel Foundry asking for a replacement. Whitechapel sends one. Pass and Stowe go back to the foundry. They melt it down a 3rd time. They adjust the mix. They recast it again. The 3rd version of the bell goes up in the steeple in June of 1753. It rings. People wince slightly, but they decide, close enough, we are keeping it. And so it hangs there in the tower of the Pennsylvania State House, ringing for legislative meetings and public announcements for the next 23 years, largely unnoticed by history, until the summer of 1776. You know by now, we talked about it 4 days ago, that the Declaration of Independence was formally adopted on the afternoon of July 4th, 1776. But here is something most people never consider. The delegates in that room voted in a closed session. The ordinary people of Philadelphia had no idea what had just happened inside those walls. But in Philadelphia itself, on the morning of July 5th, most people woke up and went about their business. They did not know. It was not until July 8th, 4 full days after independence had been declared, that the city finally came together to hear it. On the morning of July 8th, 1776, the bells of Philadelphia began to ring, all of them, every bell in the city, including, almost certainly, the bell in the steeple of the Pennsylvania State House. They rang to summon the people. Come hear something. At noon, a colonel of the Pennsylvania militia named John Nixon climbed the platform in the State House yard. He was a respected man, member of the Committee of Safety, commander of the river defenses, a man the crowd trusted. He unfolded the document, and he read it out loud, for the very first time in public, to the people, not to delegates, not to wealthy merchants in a closed room, to the people. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. John Adams was in the city that day. He later wrote to a friend that the crowd's response was unlike anything he had ever seen. He wrote, "3 cheers rended the welkin." The welkin, an old word for the sky. 3 cheers that split the sky open. After the reading, the crowd erupted into celebration. On September 11, 1777, George Washington's army was defeated at the Battle of Brandywine Creek in Pennsylvania. The road to Philadelphia was open. The British were coming. The city had to be evacuated. Important things had to be saved, and among the most important things, the bells. Not just for sentimental reasons. The British Army was notorious for melting down the bells of captured cities to make cannons and bullets. Patriots throughout the colonies had watched it happen. On the night of September 14th and into the 15th, a convoy of more than 700 wagons rolled quietly out of Philadelphia in the darkness. 200 cavalry soldiers rode guard. And hidden on those wagons, beneath loads of hay and manure, so no British scout would look twice, were 11 bells from the churches and public buildings of Philadelphia, including the great bell from the tower of the Pennsylvania State House. The convoy traveled north for 9 days. At one point, the wagon carrying the State House bell broke down entirely under its 2,000-pound weight. It was transferred to a fresh wagon belonging to a farmer and distiller named Frederick Leeser, who hitched up 4 strong black horses and carried it the rest of the way. The wagons arrived at a small church in what is now Allentown, Pennsylvania, the Zion Reformed Church. Soldiers carried the 11 bells down into the church basement, and they hid them under the floorboards. 3 days later, the British Army marched into Philadelphia. They searched the city, they stripped it, they used the State House as their headquarters, but they never found the bells. For 9 months, through the bitter winter of 1777 and into the spring of 1778, the great bell that had rung for the first reading of the Declaration of Independence lay silent, hidden in the dark beneath the floor of a Pennsylvania church. For decades after the Revolution, the bell hung in its steeple and rang for the great events of the young republic. It rang when George Washington died, when John Adams died, when Jefferson died. The bell marked the passing of the founders one by one, tolling for each of them from the same tower where the Declaration had been proclaimed. But something was happening to the bell. Slowly, imperceptibly, a hairline crack was forming, spreading, growing. On February 23, 1846, the city of Philadelphia decided to ring the bell in celebration of George Washington's birthday. Workers rang it. And the crack, which had been there for years, managed and monitored, drilled out at the edges to keep it from spreading, the crack gave way completely. A 2-foot-long zigzag fracture tore up the side of the bell. The sound died mid-ring, and the Liberty Bell has not made a sound since. It sits now in its own glass pavilion near Independence Hall in Philadelphia, silent, still cracked, still magnificent. Still drawing millions of visitors who come to stand beside it and feel something they cannot quite name. But now I have to tell you the part of this story that stops me every time. For the first 60 years of its existence, this bell was never called the Liberty Bell. Nobody called it that. It was just the State House bell. A big, cracked, slightly embarrassing bell that needed to be recast 3 times and still did not sound quite right. The name came from somewhere nobody expected. In the 1830s, American abolitionists, the men and women fighting to end slavery, began looking for symbols, for images that could carry their cause, and they found this bell. Not because it was famous, it was not famous yet. They found it because of those words inscribed around its crown: "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof." One abolitionist writer looked at that bell and wrote these words: "Hitherto, the bell has not obeyed its inscription. Its peals have been a mockery, while 1/6 of all inhabitants are in abject slavery." 1/6 of all inhabitants. The abolitionists looked at a bell that proclaimed liberty and saw a country that had not yet kept its promise. And they picked up that bell, that cracked, imperfect, twice recast, struggling bell, and they made it their symbol. In 1837, an anti-slavery publication used an image of the bell on its cover. 2 years later, in 1839, the great abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison reprinted a poem in his newspaper, The Liberator, a poem called The Liberty Bell. That was the first time anyone ever called it that, the Liberty Bell, not the Founding Fathers, not the Continental Congress, not the citizens of Philadelphia who heard it ring on July 8, 1776. The abolitionists named it because they believed in what it said, even though they were living in a country that had not yet made those words true. And from that moment, the bell became something more than a bell. Women fighting for the right to vote rallied around it. Civil rights leaders came to Philadelphia to stand beside it. The Dalai Lama visited it. Martin Luther King Jr. was celebrated at it. Oppressed people from all over the world came to Philadelphia to say out loud what the inscription said: proclaim liberty. Every single group that ever came to that bell was saying the same thing. The abolitionists said, "We are still waiting for those words to mean what they say." So here is the whole story of the Liberty Bell. A Pennsylvania legislature ordered it in 1751 to honor a colonial charter. They chose a Bible verse. The Whitechapel foundry cast it. It cracked on its first ring. 2 local craftsmen melted it down, recast it, melted it down again, recast it again, and got it close enough to hang. It hung in a tower for 23 years before history came calling. On July 8, 1776, it rang with every other bell in Philadelphia to call ordinary people to hear the words that would define their nation. And those words, "All men are created equal," rang out over the same city where people were still being bought and sold. A year later, the bell was smuggled out of the city under hay and manure on a wagon, hidden under a church floor for 9 months, and brought home when the British left. It rang for the deaths of the founders, one by one. It cracked for good in 1846 while ringing for George Washington's birthday. And in 1839, 60 years after the Revolution, abolitionists looked at that cracked, imperfect, embarrassing bell with the Bible verse on it and said, "This is ours. This is what we are fighting for." And they gave it the name it carries to this day, the Liberty Bell. I think the crack is the whole story. That was hidden in the dark and came home again. That rang until it could not ring anymore and then stood silent while generation after generation came to stand beside it and feel the weight of what is still unfinished. That is not a symbol of a perfect country. It is a symbol of a country that keeps trying. A country that proclaims liberty even when it has not yet figured out how to deliver it. A country that writes, "All men are created equal," and then spends the next 250 years arguing about what those words require of us. I find that honest, and I find it beautiful, and it makes me think, as it always does, about the stories we carry that are not finished yet either. The things we believe in that we have not yet fully lived up to. The promises we have made to ourselves and to our families that we are still working toward. Those unfinished stories are not failures. They are the most human thing about us. I would love for you to write some of them down, not just the triumphs, the cracks too. The recasting, the times you were hidden away in the dark and came home again. Those are the stories your children will need someday. The ones that say, "Here is what we were really like. Here is what we kept trying for anyway." There is a free family story writing guide waiting for you right below this video, and I hope you will take it. Because the story that is not yet finished is always the most important one to write. On this July 8th, Liberty Bell Day, thank you for spending this time with me in one of the greatest stories America has ever told about itself. If this moved you, please subscribe to History Sparks and come back every single day. We tell the full stories here, the famous ones and the forgotten ones. The triumphs and the cracks. The bells that broke and the people who kept ringing them anyway. Share this today with someone who loves America enough to know its full story. I am Sarah. I will see you next time, right here on History Sparks.